Hey y'all, it's me again. I'm going to continue reading from my book, The Secret Lives of the First Lady. To the rescue! A Marquis de Lafayette, a young French nobleman who served in Washington's army during the Revolution, personified his native land's friendship with the United States. But when the revolutionary concepts he fought for in the New World came to France, they came with a lot more severity and violence. Indeed, men like Lafayette and their families were suddenly under attack in revolutionary France for their aristocratic ties and soon found their necks in the guillotine. It was at the height of this bloodthirsty period, 1795, when Elizabeth Monroe performed the one public act for which she is chiefly remembered. Her husband, then the American minister to France, learned that Lafayette's wife had been in prison and was slated for execution. He was powerless to act officially on her behalf, though he desperately wanted to. Such an intervention would jeopardize his country's relationship with France. Monroe's wife, on the other hand, was a different matter altogether. Elizabeth agreed to visit the poor Marquis, and traveling to the prison in a coach displaying her husband's diplomatic seal drew quite a crowd. She entered, visited briefly, then stood and loudly proclaimed that she would call on the poor woman again tomorrow. The guards who overheard this soon spread the word, and the Marquis, whose execution was scheduled for that very day, was spared indefinitely, solely on the threat that Mrs. Monroe might show up for another conversation and be horrified at the Marquis's absence. Her obvious attachment to the American envoy and his wife scared off the French government, which wanted to avoid scandalizing the United States. Secret sickness. The illness that always seemed to keep Elizabeth from making frequent public appearances had remained cloaked in mystery. She probably suffered from arthritis. Some historians speculate that she was also afflicted with epilepsy. Little to nothing was known about the falling disease, as it was then called, and it was almost certainly a source of embarrassment to both Elizabeth and her husband. Perhaps this is why they remained so elusive about her health and condition. Strange then mentioned that she was prone to convulsions, one of which she suffered while sitting before a fireplace, which left her burned after she fell into it. Chapter 5. Louisa Catherine Adams, February 12th, 1775 through May 15th, 1852. Married July 26, 1797. Presidential husband, John Quincy Adams. Children, George Washington, John, Charles Francis, and Louisa Catherine. First Lady, from 1825 to 1829. Astrological sign, Aquarius. I don't know why I couldn't say that at first. Ugh. Religion, Catholic. This sort of. Soundbite. Debt and maintenance is a penalty imposed by the salary of an American minister. Louisa Catherine Johnson Adams was an accomplished scholar, literature, and musician, but her greatest accomplishment may well be that she survived a long marriage to the most cantankerous president in American history, John Quincy Adams. The second daughter of 8 children, Louisa was born in London to an English mother and an American-born father. The family lived in France between 1778 and 1783, where Louisa learned French and was influenced by the Roman Catholic faith. It wasn't long before the Johnsons realized that they had a prodigy on their hands. Louisa was a poet, a singer, despite her shyness, and could play the harp and piano with ease. Her father's mercantile wealth paid for lessons and instruction, and it seemed as if the bright girl had great expectations. In 1795, she met another prodigy. John Quincy Adams, the son of the American Vice President John Adams, was in London on a diplomatic mission and soon had eyes for the charming and beautiful Louisa. He was the most well-traveled young man in all the United States and boasted a towering intellect to boot. But grace with the opposite sex was not one of John Quincy's many gifts, and his courtship of Louisa was so clumsy that it took the poor girl weeks just to figure out that he was interested in her. By May of 1796, she had spent enough time with him to overlook his nerdier qualities, and she consented to marry him. GQA responded by postponing the wedding indefinitely, offering a window into the chaotic heap of neuroses that clouded his mind. Like all Adamses, he was preoccupied with money, or more specifically, the lack thereof, and insisted on waiting until he was sure of his financial future. A day that will never come, actually. That and the fact that he possessed a conspicuous lack of sensitivity toward people began to wear on Louisa's patience. She wrote him a series of letters that pleaded and fumed until GQA finally consented to meet at the altar in July of 1797. While visiting New York in 1807, Louisa Adams' infant son was snatched from her arms by a thief. She gave chase and eventually recovered the baby. But there wasn't much of a honeymoon. The marriage was difficult from day one and really got better. For his part, JQA found his financial fears confirmed upon the discovery that his new father-in-law, Joshua Johnson, had in fact become bankrupt, leaving Mr. and Mrs. John Quincy Adams with little to live on beyond his meager diplomat's salary. It was the sort of mishap that stuck in JQA's craw, never to come loose and fuel his already frightful predilection toward irritability and depression. Soon Louisa found herself married to a man who found fault in everybody, and despite his own parents' equitable relationship, he firmly believed in the subservience of the fairer sex, even when they were brilliant, gifted, and vicarious, like his wife. If Louisa hoped things would improve in 1801, when John Quincy was recalled home from his diplomatic circuit in Europe, she was sorely disappointed. Upon meeting her famously uncompromising in-laws in Quincy, Massachusetts, poor Louisa found herself lacking. Former First Lady Abigail Adams, who had opposed her son's marriage to an English woman, was particularly hard, finding fault in all that Louisa tried to do. Born and bred of European wealth, Louisa was jolted by the frugality and homespun self-reliance of New England. Had I stepped into Noah's Ark, I do not think I would have been more utterly astonished. She would have preferred almost anywhere else. Say Washington, for example, which is where she was off to in 1803 when John Quincy got elected to the Senate. The American capital was a breath of fresh air, not the least because the remnants of her own family lived there. She went horse riding whenever possible, took trips to the racetrack, tried to ignore the beating her husband was taking in the political arena. The unscrupulous combat of politics would always suppress her. She could have known that soon enough it would all come to an end, and that she would find herself in a place that made New England look like paradise. In 1809, President James Madison appointed John Quincy Adams minister to Russia. No one consulted Louisa about the monumentous move, and that made her angry. But what really seemed really was the fact that her husband, in his infinite capacity for cruelty, had made arrangements for their two other sons to stay behind in America. Louisa would have to face the rigors of a frozen foreign land without even the company of her beloved George and John. Only little Charles Francis would make the journey. It was a blow from which she never truly recovered. She did not see the United States again for over 8 years. When James Monroe appointed JQA Secretary of State in 1817, it was an invitation to start looking forward to the White House. The State Department had always been viewed as grooming for the top dog position, and few Secretaries of State could look back upon a career as impressive as John Quincy's. He threw his hat into the ring in 1824, and Louisa, for the first time in her life, began playing a vital role in his professional career. For years, she and her husband had butted heads over women's rights, raising the children, even where to live. JQA preferred summering in Quincy much to Louisa's chagrin, but now she learned her keen mind in trying to John Quincy's cause. She threw elaborate and outstandingly successful parties, delighted everyone with her music and poetry, and generally compensated for her husband's surliness. Her greatest coup was a bash celebrating the anniversary of Andrew Jackson's victory over the British in the War of 1812. Not only was it remembered as the party of the decade, but it craftily drew attention away from Jackson, who was JQA's principal opponent for the presidency, and to John Quincy himself. It all worked, despite a hotly contested and controversial election. JQA became the country's next chief executive. The next 4 years were enough to make Louisa wonder whether all her efforts on John Quincy's behalf had been a terrible mistake. Virtually every one of the president's policies was vehemently contested, and the poor Slav soon became a lame duck. He sank into a new nadir of grumpiness, abated only by regular swims in the Potomac, usually in the nude, and long moments of gardening, his new love. Louisa responded with feelings of estrangement and depression. They sat silently at dinner, each engrossed in their own reading material. Louisa began referring to the White House as a dull and stately prison, which is why she was overjoyed to leave it in 1829. Sick to death of official squabbling and calumny, she looked forward to a life without politics. Naturally, JQA spoiled the moment by winning a seat in the White House of Representatives. Louisa's dread notwithstanding, his years there would become the zenith of his long and distinguished career. Seeing him earn the nickname Old Man Eloquent by consistently championing such hot-button topics as abolitionism, and Louisa found herself swept up into it. She became as devoted to ending slavery as her husband, and finally discovered her own voice as well. Particularly on the issue of women's rights, such passages brought the two together, doing wonders for a partnership that had rarely been a pleasant one. Their last years together were probably the best of their marriage. Having utterly spent himself on strenuous efforts in Congress, John Quincy finally collapsed in February of 1848, finally right on the floor of the House of Representatives. He was dead 2 days later. Louisa lived only for another 4 years. Upon her death in 1852, she was buried next to her husband in Quincy, Massachusetts. In an unprecedented honor for American women, both houses of Congress adjourned for a day of mourning. It cannot be said that Louisa and JQA didn't love each other. They certainly did, as numerous tender letters attest. But their differences in temperament and outlook wore heavily on both of them. Louisa, in particular, suffered long bouts of depression that made her physically ill, and her outstanding intellectual and creative gifts were underappreciated by a husband who spent too many years looking at her as an underling or appendage. It is sad and telling that her 1840 autobiography was entitled Adventures of a Nobody. Motherload. During her childbearing years, Louisa suffered so many miscarriages and stillbirths that out of 11 pregnancies, only 3 children lived to adulthood. Granted, pregnancy was fraught with hazards in the early 18th century, but such record would be hard to bear for a woman of any era. Now, for those of her offspring who managed to live long enough, life could be pretty harsh. The Adams line seemed cursed. In 1807, Charles Francis, still an infant, was snatched from the arms of his maid in the streets of New York City. Louisa and the maid ran after the thief, who tore off with the babe and disappeared around a corner. He was found only after the two women went house to house, banging on doors. The culprit eventually emerged and gave Charles back, insisting that the little tyke was so beautiful he wanted to show him to his wife. Louisa's first child, George, delivered by an intoxicated midwife whose open ministrations left poor Louisa with a gamey leg for weeks, ended up throwing himself off a steamer in 1829. And then there's John, who died of alcoholism. We combine all this with a perpetually aloof and disagreeable husband. It's little wonder that Louisa was depressed so often. Please rate, comment, and subscribe down below. And if you're on YouTube, please ring that bell notification so that you can know when I upload. And if you're on TikTok, please like and follow my videos. And please pay for something on either my eBay and or Mercari, okay? And if you want my username for either eBay and or Mercari, please comment down below, okay? Bye!